Now, let me ask a question. What is evidence? Evidence, I will say, is all the means by which any alleged matter of fact whose truth is investigated at judicial trial is established or disproved. Now, we can have four types of evidence. We can have testimonial evidence, demonstrative evidence, circumstantial evidence, and physical evidence. So let me comment on those. Testimonial evidence, that's essentially statements given under oath. Every witness gives this type of evidence. So in court, when you're on the stand, you get sworn in, and then you tell what you did. By the way, I'm going to mention this real quickly. You do not necessarily have to be an expert witness in your career as a CSI. If all you testify to is, I went to the scene, this is what I saw, this is what I did. If it comes to the point where you are asked an opinion and you give an opinion, now you have to be an expert witness. So it's very conceivable that you could go your whole career and not ever be an expert witness. Now, if you get into a specialty of bloodstain interpretation and you're giving the opinion of where somebody was standing when a bloody blow occurred, now you're getting into opinion and you're going to need to be qualified as an expert. If you work in a crime lab and you're giving testimony about your findings, you'll be an expert, even with fingerprints. Okay, so that's testimonial evidence. Demonstrative evidence, this type of evidence occurs when the witness uses a model or a reproduction of the item or performs some action that shows or demonstrates a point in issue. It could be a crime scene diagram. It could be holding up the murder weapon. So that's demonstrative evidence. Then there's circumstantial evidence. Oh my, not circumstantial evidence. Actually, most evidence seems to be circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is just as good as the other three types of evidence. Circumstantial evidence is evidence that relies on an inference to connect it to a conclusion of fact. This is evidence that may be presumed. This can put items of physical evidence into perspective. The relevancy of circumstantial evidence is based primarily on logic, reasonableness, good sense, and good judgment. But defense attorneys often will say to the jury in closing, it's all circumstantial evidence. Okay, people get convicted on circumstantial evidence because it can be overwhelming. And then the last I have listed there is physical evidence. In court, they sometimes call it real evidence. Physical evidence is any material object that plays some actual role in the matter that gave rise to the litigation, introduced in a trial intended to prove a fact in issue based on its demonstrable physical characteristics. So this is what we normally think of as evidence, isn't it? Now, since we're talking about physical evidence, I want to talk about class characteristics and individual characteristics. All evidence bears characteristics. You can have class characteristics, and then you can also have individual characteristics, but you don't always have individual characteristics on all evidence. You may only have class characteristics. So what is the difference? Class characteristics, that's physical evidence that can be placed into groups with their items having similar properties. Let's say you have a footwear impression. Is it an athletic shoe or is it a boot? Well, those are two different classes. Is it a Nike because we see the swish in the pattern? Or is it an Adidas because we see it say Adidas in the pattern? Well, those are two different classes. Is it a size 12? That's a class. Size 11 is a different class. Is it a certain model? Now we can tell this is a Nike Air Jordan, and this one is not. Those are classes. Another thing would be blood, the species of a blood sample. This is human, this is dog. Could be ABO typing of a blood sample, like AB negative and type O. Those are class characteristics. The make and model of a firearm. This is a Beretta S9000. That's a class characteristic because there were thousands of them made. So what makes an individual characteristic? That's physical evidence that's unique to a specific individual source. So what are some examples of that? A fingerprint. Now, you could have a class characteristic of a fingerprint, let's say a whorl pattern or an arch pattern. Those are class characteristics, but the individual ridges and bifurcation and dots, all of that will end up with an individual characteristic fingerprint that no other fingerprint in that same class would share. Let's go to the shoe print. There may be a wear pattern or a defect of some sort in the tread that matches that to a specific shoe that has that defect. Now that is an individual characteristic. DNA, when we're talking about blood types, those are class characteristics, but DNA can narrow it down to one person or a pair of identical twins. Striation marks on a fired bullet, that can lead us to a specific firearm, and so forth. When we are finding evidence, which would we prefer to find? Well, the individual characteristic evidence, right? But sometimes we don't find that. Sometimes a shoe impression will just give us a class characteristic. Well, that's not bad in itself. What if we say, okay, this person was wearing Nike Air Jordan model whatever, and then we serve a search warrant on our suspect and we find in the closet Nike Air Jordans of that model. That's good evidence. That's not individual characteristics. We can't say it's the exact shoe that did it, but how many people have Nike Air Jordans in their closet that are getting search warrants for this crime? It can help us. A little more about evidence. The 5-second rule. What is the 5-second rule? The 5-second rule, that is a Western cultural food hygiene concept that states that there is a defined window where it's permissible to pick up food after it's been dropped and thus exposed to contamination. So we have this 5-second rule. Rutgers University in 2016 did a study, is the 5-second rule real? Well, they concluded that no matter how fast you pick up food that falls on the floor, you will pick up bacteria with it. Now, why is that important? Because we are dealing with evidence, and a lot of evidence is, in a way, contamination. That leads me to Dr. Edmund Locard, who he was a pioneer in forensic science, and he became known as the Sherlock Holmes of France. He had Locard's exchange principle. And Locard's exchange principle holds that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something into the crime scene and leave with something from it, and both can be used as forensic evidence. So bad guy comes in and leaves their DNA behind, picks up broken glass and gets on his clothes and he leaves. So now you've got evidence at the scene from the suspect, and you have evidence on the suspect from the scene. So because of the 5-second rule, we should be celebrating because stuff gets left behind or picked up, just like bacteria. So he formulated the basic principle that we now hear in forensic science: every contact leaves a trace. This is what Paul Kirk, a very notable individual, Paul Leland Kirk, who lived from 1902 to 1970, was a chemist, forensic scientist. He was also a participant in the Manhattan Project. He also received the highest honor that the American Academy of Forensic Sciences could give. This is what he wrote. While I hate to read my slides, I'm going to read this because this is exciting. This gets me excited every time I read it. Wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass he breaks, the tool mark he leaves, the paint he scratches, the blood or semen he deposits or collects. All of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself. It cannot be wholly absent. Only human failure to find it, study, and understand it can diminish its value. That gives me hope when I am on my hands and knees at a crime scene looking for trace evidence. And believe me, being a CSI has gotten more difficult over the years. When I started in law enforcement in 1972, doing a crime scene was pretty straightforward. We would dust for fingerprints and take some pictures. And if you had a footwear impression, we'd use plaster cast. And that was about it. But now with trace evidence and with the computers that can search databases for fingerprints and microscopic evidence, it has gotten more complicated and more critical as we work. So this should give us all hope.